If you have that baby, I'll destroy your family. My world has no place for mistakes, the Korean mafia boss warned, his eyes cold as ice. But 7 years later, he froze when he saw her walking with a sharp-looking young boy who had his exact glare. "Hi," the boy said, stepping in front of his mother protectively. "Are you bothering her?" This is mission 1000 likes for every mother who chose her child over the man who tried to erase them both. If you believe a mother's love is the most powerful force on earth, like this video. If you believe redemption must be earned in blood and tears, comment EARNED, not given. I'm here with you. There are some threats that shatter a woman so completely. The pieces reassemble into someone unrecognizable, someone harder, sharper, and infinitely more dangerous than the girl who walked into that room. And on the night Seo, Jiwoo pressed his thumb against Christiana Brown's stomach and told her to eliminate the problem growing inside her. He created the weapon that would one day dismantle everything he built. Christiana stood in the center of his private study, rain hammering against the windows of the syndicate compound like fists demanding entry. The scent of expensive whiskey and old wood filled the air, suffocating her as she pressed both hands protectively over her abdomen. She had come here with hope flickering foolishly in her chest, had imagined telling him about the baby, and watching his severe face crack open with something resembling joy. She had believed, stupidly, desperately, that the man who kissed her forehead after making love and called her naysaying might choose her over duty. Instead, Jiwoo stood before her in his tailored black suit, his face carved from stone, looking at her the way he looked at informants before ordering their executions. The man who had whispered promises against her skin had vanished, replaced by the dragon head of the Beak Paw Syndicate, a title that left no room for softness, no space for mistakes like the one currently dividing cells inside her womb. His father sat in the corner, a phantom of smoke and malice, watching the scene with the satisfaction of a director whose script was unfolding exactly as planned. The marriage contract to the Nakamura family's daughter lay on the desk between them, ink already dry, alliance already sealed. Christiana was the loose thread that needed cutting before the tapestry could be completed. "There's a doctor," Jiwoo said, his voice stripped of every tender inflection she had memorized during their stolen year together. "He's discreet. He'll handle this tonight. You'll be compensated for your inconvenience. $30,000 should more than cover any expenses and allow you to relocate if you prefer." Christiana felt something inside her chest crack, a clean, irreparable break that would echo through the rest of her life. She had known about the engagement, had known Jiwoo was being pressured into a strategic marriage, had convinced herself that what they shared was strong enough to rewrite the rules of his world. But standing there with his abortion money and his father's cruel smile, she finally understood that she had been a distraction, something warm and willing to fill his empty hours while the elders arranged his real future. "I'm keeping the baby," she whispered, and watched his expression shift from cold dismissal to something darker, something that made her instinctively step back until her spine hit the bookshelf. Jiwoo moved toward her with the predatory grace of a man who had killed with his hands and never lost sleep over it. "You're not thinking clearly," he said, each word measured and lethal. "The Nakamura alliance secures our position against the Triad expansion. The wedding is in 3 weeks. If you keep this child, if anyone discovers what happened between us, her family will consider it a humiliation. They'll withdraw from the alliance and will be vulnerable to the war we've been avoiding for 5 years. Everything I've sacrificed will collapse. So you're asking me to choose your empire over our child," Christiana said, adding how her voice trembled on the last word. "I'm telling you what will happen if you don't," Jiwoo replied, and his next words came out like bullets. "Your mother teaches at Westbridge Academy, doesn't she? Headmistress of the arts department. It would be tragic if accusations of financial misconduct emerged. A single investigation could destroy her career and her reputation. And your father's medical practice, the one treating patients in underserved neighborhoods. I know every hospital board member personally. One conversation and his malpractice insurance disappears. His clinic closes. The patients he cares about suffer." Christiana stared at him, watching the man she loved threaten the 2 people who raised her with the casual efficiency of someone ordering takeout. She thought about her mother, who had worked 3 jobs to send her to art school, who cried with pride when Christiana secured her position at the museum. She thought about her father, who had dedicated his life to healing people who couldn't afford to be sick. Jiwoo was offering her a choice that wasn't a choice at all: surrender or watch her family burn. "Take the money," Jiwoo said, and his hand reached out to cup her face with a gentleness that felt like mockery. "Go to the doctor. In a few months, this will feel like a bad dream. I can't give you what you want, Christiana. I can't be the man standing outside this world. But I can make sure you're taken care of financially. That has to be enough." She looked at him for a long moment, memorizing the sharp angles of his face, the small scar above his left eyebrow from a knife fight he'd never explained, the way his jaw clenched when he was lying to himself. Then she picked up the envelope and nodded slowly. "Okay, I'll handle it." The relief that flooded his expression made her want to be sick, but she kept her face blank as she walked toward the door. His hand caught her wrist, pulling her back for one last kiss that tasted like goodbye and gasoline. "I'm sorry," he whispered against her lips, and for a split second, she saw the man she loved flickering behind the monster's eyes. "I wish things could be different." "So do I," Christiana replied, meaning it in ways he would never understand until it was far too late. She left his compound with the envelope clutched against her chest, walked through the rain until her dress clung to her skin, and stood at a payphone for 20 minutes before calling her parents. Her father answered on the second ring, his voice warm with concern, and Christiana had to press her forehead against the cold glass to keep from collapsing. "Papa," she whispered, "I need you to trust me. Don't ask questions. Can you and Mama meet me at the airport?" The pause lasted an eternity. Then, "We'll be there in 30 minutes. Christiana hung up, placed one hand over her stomach, and made a promise to the life growing inside her. "You will never know this world. You will never know his cruelty. I will raise you in the light, far from the darkness that made you." She boarded a flight to London 12 hours later with a new passport, a new name, and the unshakable knowledge that Seo Jiwoo had just made the worst mistake of his life. Because 7 years from now, she would return, not as the frightened girl he had destroyed, but as the woman who would systematically dismantle everything he valued, starting with the stolen artifacts that funded his empire and ending with the cold, empty throne he'd chosen over his own son. And when he finally saw what he had lost, when he looked into the eyes of the boy who inherited his glare but none of his cruelty, it would be far too late to beg for forgiveness. The dragon had shown his teeth. Now the phoenix would show hers. Christiana had to rebuild her life from zero because a toxic man's threat. If you believe no one should ever be bullied into giving up their family, smash that like button. Don't let the Jiwoos of the world win. The elders arrived at midnight, which meant blood or business, and Seo Jiwoo had learned long ago that in his world, the two were often indistinguishable. He stood at the window of his private office in the compound, watching their black sedans roll through the gates like a funeral procession, and felt the trap closing around him with the inevitability of a blade finding flesh. His father entered first, moving with the careful precision of a man who had survived 40 years in the syndicate by never showing weakness. Behind him came the others: Old Man Choi with his liver-spotted hands and shark smile, Director H. Wang who controlled the gambling operations, and Lady Min, the only woman ever permitted into the inner circle, whose soft voice had ordered more executions than all of them combined. They arranged themselves around the conference table like judges at a trial. And Jiwoo knew, before anyone spoke, that his life, as he understood it, was about to end. "The Nakamura family has accepted our proposal," his father said, sliding a red folder across the polished wood. "The wedding will take place in 3 weeks. Their daughter Akiko arrives from Osaka next Monday to begin the preparations." Jiwoo didn't open the folder. He didn't need to see the contract to understand what was being sold: his future, his autonomy, whatever foolish hope he'd been harboring that he could choose his own path. The marriage wasn't about love or even heirs. It was about survival. The Nakamura family controlled shipping routes through Busan and Incheon, territory the syndicate desperately needed to counter the triad expansion creeping up from the south. Akiko was the price of peace, and Jiwoo was the currency. "She's educated at Cambridge," Lady Min added, her voice pleasant as poisoned honey. "Speaks 4 languages, understands the nature of our business and her role in it. She won't make demands or cause complications. A perfect match for a man of your position." The words hung in the air like smoke, and Jiwoo heard what wasn't being said, unlike whoever you've been wasting time with lately. They knew. Of course they knew. The syndicate had eyes everywhere, and he'd been careless, letting Christiana into parts of his life that should have remained locked and guarded. He'd been weak, believing for one reckless year that he could separate the man from the monster, that there was still some part of him untouched by violence and calculation. "I understand," Jiwoo said, because there was nothing else to say. Refusal wasn't an option. Refusal meant civil war within the syndicate, meant the elders selecting a more obedient heir, meant his father's life's work crumbling while rival factions tore the organization apart. He'd been raised from birth to prioritize the collective over the individual, duty over desire. This was simply the bill coming due. The elders left satisfied, their sedans disappearing back into the night, and Jiwoo sat alone in his office with the red folder unopened, and a bottle of whiskey that did nothing to wash away the taste of his own cowardice. His phone showed 3 missed calls from Christiana, and he stared at her name on the screen for a long time before finally calling her back. She arrived an hour later, drenched from the rain, her hair plastered to her face and her eyes bright with something that made his stomach turn. Hope. She dressed carefully in the blue dress he'd once told her he loved, had worn the perfume that always made him pull her closer, and he realized with a sickening clarity that she'd thought he was calling her here for something beautiful. She'd thought tonight was going to change their lives in the way young, naive people believed love could overcome reality. "Jiwoo," she said, smiling despite the rain, and he wanted to tell her to run, to leave before he destroyed the light in her eyes. But the words stuck in his throat, trapped behind years of conditioning that taught him sentiment was weakness, that caring about anything more than power was a fatal flaw. Instead, he told her the truth with all the gentleness carved out of him. "I'm getting married in 3 weeks, to Akiko Nakamura. It's a strategic alliance that's been arranged by the elders." He watched her face transform from joy to confusion to devastating comprehension, watched the exact moment her heart broke, and hated himself with an intensity that felt like drowning. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly small in the vast office, and he wanted to cross the distance between them, wanted to hold her the way he had on all those nights when the world felt manageable and his future seemed like something he could shape instead of something shaped by him. "I thought," she started, then stopped, shaking her head. "I came here to tell you something. I'm pregnant, Jiwoo, almost 3 months. I wanted to tell you sooner, but I was scared, and now I understand why I was scared, because you're standing there talking about marrying someone else like I'm nothing, like we're nothing, like this baby." The words hit him like physical blows, and for one terrible moment, Jiwoo felt the carefully constructed walls he'd built around himself start to crack. A baby. Their baby. The thought filled him with a terror so profound he could barely breathe, because he knew exactly what would happen if the elders discovered this complication. They would eliminate it with the same efficiency they eliminated all threats to the organization. They would hurt Christiana, would make her disappear, would erase the evidence and teach him a lesson about the cost of defiance. "You can't keep it," he said, and the words came out harsher than he intended, sharp enough to make her flinch. "This can't happen, Christiana. Not now. Not with the Nakamura alliance being finalized. If the elders find out, if Akiko's family discovers I have a pregnant mistress hidden away." He stopped, hatting the word even as he used it, watching it land on her like a slap. "I'm not your mistress," she whispered. "I'm the woman you told you loved. I'm carrying your child." "And that child will get you killed," Jiwoo said, moving toward her with desperation clawing at his chest. "Don't you understand? This world doesn't forgive mistakes. The syndicate doesn't allow loose ends. There's a doctor, someone discreet who handles these situations. I'll pay for everything, I'll make sure you're taken care of financially, but you have to end this pregnancy before anyone else finds out." Christiana stared at him like he was speaking a foreign language, like the man standing in front of her was a stranger wearing Jiwoo's face. "I'm not getting an abortion because your criminal organization finds my baby inconvenient." The word, baby, hung between them, and Jiwoo felt his control slipping, felt the panic rising in his throat like bile. He thought about the elders, about his father's cold pragmatism, about the bodies he'd seen disposed of for far smaller transgressions than threatening a multi-million-dollar alliance. He thought about Christiana's gentle parents who taught at schools and ran medical clinics, who had no idea their daughter had fallen in love with a monster, who would be completely defenseless if the syndicate decided to send a message. "If you have that baby," Jiwoo said, and his voice dropped to something dark and final, "I will destroy your family. Your mother's school will burn. Your father's clinic will burn. Everything they've built, everyone they've helped, I'll turn it all to ash. That's not a threat, Christiana. That's a promise. Because that's what the elders will order me to do to prove my loyalty, to show that nothing matters more than the syndicate, and I won't be able to stop it. He watched her face go pale, watched understanding dawn in her eyes, not just that he was threatening her family, but that he meant every word. This was who he really was beneath the stolen kisses and whispered endearments. This was the dragon head, the heir to an empire built on fear and violence, the man who would sacrifice anything to maintain power. Get the abortion, he continued, pulling an envelope from his desk and pressing it into her shaking hands. Take the money. Disappear for a few months if you need to. But end this pregnancy, or I swear to God, Christiana, I will burn your entire world down and make you watch. She stood there holding the envelope, tears streaming down her face, and Jiwoo forced himself to turn away before his resolve shattered completely. He heard her leave, heard the door close with quiet finality, and told himself he'd done the right thing. He'd saved her life. The syndicate would have killed her and the baby both. At least this way, she would survive. At least this way, she would hate him instead of mourning him. 3 days later, Christiana called him from a hospital, her voice flat and distant. It's done. The pregnancy is over. You got what you wanted. Jiwoo closed his eyes, feeling something essential inside him die. I'm sorry, he said, though the words were inadequate for the magnitude of what he'd forced her to do. No, you're not, Christiana replied, but you will be. She hung up, and Jiwoo never heard from her again. Her apartment was empty by that evening, her phone disconnected, her job at the museum abandoned with 2 weeks' notice submitted by email. She'd vanished completely, erasing herself from his city and his life with the thoroughness of someone who never wanted to be found. He married Akiko Nakamura 3 weeks later in a ceremony attended by 500 guests and devoid of anything resembling joy. The alliance secured the shipping routes. The syndicate's positions strengthened. His father clapped him on the shoulder with something resembling approval. And Jiwoo stood at the reception, accepting congratulations, while feeling absolutely nothing. He told himself Christiana was safe somewhere, starting over, building a life far from the violence that defined his existence. He told himself she would eventually forgive him, would understand he'd been protecting her the only way he knew how. He never suspected that in a small London flat, Christiana Brown was already showing, her belly swelling with the son she'd sworn to protect from the monster who tried to erase him. She'd faked the miscarriage with the help of a sympathetic doctor and her father's medical connections, had taken Jiwoo's blood money and used it to disappear properly, completely, absolutely. And as Seo Jiwoo sealed his loveless marriage with champagne and empty promises, Christiana stood at a window overlooking the Thames, one hand on her stomach, and whispered a different kind of vow. He'll never find us. And when I'm ready, when we're strong enough, I'll make sure he knows exactly what he destroyed. I'll make sure it costs him everything. The dragon had shown his teeth. The phoenix was learning to fly. 7 years passed like a slow hemorrhage, each day bleeding into the next, until Seo Jiwoo could barely remember what warmth felt like. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, looking down at the city that feared his name, and felt nothing except the familiar weight of emptiness pressing against his chest like a stone. The dragon head. That's what they called him now, whispered in back rooms and dark alleys, spoken with the kind of reverence reserved for natural disasters and divine punishment. He'd consolidated power with ruthless efficiency after his father's retirement, had absorbed 3 rival organizations, and expanded the syndicate's reach into legitimate businesses that made their criminal enterprises look like rounding errors on a balance sheet. Real estate, tech startups, pharmaceutical companies. Jiwoo had built an empire that operated in daylight while its roots sprawled through darkness, and nobody dared question how a 32-year-old could accumulate that much wealth that quickly. His marriage to Akiko had lasted 18 months before ending in quiet divorce, the alliance secured, and her family's shipping routes permanently integrated into syndicate operations. She'd moved back to Osaka with a settlement large enough to buy silence and a formal statement about irreconcilable differences that fooled nobody. They'd been professionals about it, 2 people playing roles in a transaction that had nothing to do with compatibility and everything to do with power. She'd never asked about the way he sometimes woke up gasping in the middle of the night, never questioned why he kept the master bedroom locked and slept in his office instead. Jiwoo told himself he didn't think about Christiana, told himself the phantom weight of her absence wasn't the reason he couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't feel anything except the cold calculation required to survive in a world where sentiment was a blade pressed against your throat. But late at night, when the city went quiet and his guard stood vigil outside his door, he would pull up the last photo he had of her on his phone, a candid shot from the museum where she was laughing at something, her face bright with the kind of joy he'd systematically destroyed, and wonder if she was happy wherever she disappeared to. Wonder if she'd found someone gentle who didn't deal in threats and violence. Wonder if she ever thought about the man who'd loved her just enough to ruin both their lives. His father had died 3 years ago, a heart attack at 71 that surprised nobody except in its timing. Jiwoo had stood at the funeral accepting condolences with appropriate solemnity while feeling a complicated mixture of grief and relief. The old man had built the syndicate into what it was, had taught Jiwoo that power required sacrifice, and love was a luxury people like them couldn't afford. He'd been right about everything except the part where this was supposed to feel like victory. Now Jiwoo sat in meetings with politicians and CEOs, laundered money through art galleries and luxury hotels, made decisions that affected thousands of lives with the stroke of a pen. He was 32 years old and controlled an empire worth billions, and he would have traded it all for the chance to go back to that rain-soaked night and make a different choice. Would have walked away from everything if it meant Christiana would still look at him like he was human, instead of like he was the monster who'd threatened to burn her parents alive. But time only moved in one direction, and regret was just another kind of prison. Christiana had to rebuild her life from zero because of a toxic man's threat. If you believe no one should ever be bullied into giving up their family, smash that like button. Don't let the Jiwoos of the world win. Across an ocean and a continent, in a bright London townhouse near Regent's Park, Christiana Brown woke to the sound of her 7-year-old son solving a Rubik's Cube in the kitchen while reciting the periodic table from memory. She lay in bed for a moment listening to his voice, serious and precise, exactly like his father's, though Michael King had never met the man and never would if she had anything to say about it. She'd rebuilt herself from ash and fury, transformed from the terrified girl who'd fled soul into someone entirely new. Dr. Christiana Vale, art restitution expert, specializing in recovering stolen cultural artifacts from museums and private collectors. She'd earned her doctorate at Oxford while pregnant, had leveraged her museum experience and natural eye for provenance into a reputation that made her one of the most sought-after specialists in her field. Governments called her when they needed to track down antiquities looted during war. Interpol consulted her on cases involving the black market art trade. She charged obscene fees and donated half to organizations that helped women escape domestic violence. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd become an expert at finding things that powerful people tried to hide, at following money trails through shell corporations and offshore accounts, at exposing the criminal networks that trafficked in stolen beauty. She'd taken everything Jiwoo taught her about how the underworld operated and turned it into a weapon aimed directly at men like him. Michael appeared in her doorway holding the solved Rubik's Cube, his dark hair still messy from sleep, his eyes sharp with the kind of awareness that sometimes frightened her. He looked exactly like Jiwoo, had inherited his father's severe features, his intense stare, the way he moved with unconscious grace even at 7 years old. But Michael's eyes held warmth his father's never had, held curiosity and compassion, and a protective streak that made him step between her and strangers who looked at her too long. "Mama, why do people steal art?" he asked, climbing onto her bed with the directness of a child who'd learned early that his mother answered questions honestly. "If they like it, why don't they just go to the museum where everyone can see it?" Christiana pulled him close, breathing in the scent of his shampoo and the laundry detergent that smelled like lavender. Because some people believe that owning something beautiful makes them powerful. They think that if they're the only one who gets to see it, it means they're special. "That's stupid," Michael said matter-of-factly. "Art is supposed to be shared. That's why artists make it." She smiled, kissing the top of his head. "You're absolutely right. That's why Mama's job exists, to find the stolen art and bring it back where it belongs." Michael was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing patterns on the Rubik's Cube. Is that why we left Korea? Because someone was trying to own us. Christiana's breath caught. Michael rarely asked about his father, had accepted from an early age that some families looked different than others, that not everyone had two parents. She'd told him his father was dangerous, that they'd left to stay safe, but she'd never detailed the threats or the violence that had defined her relationship with Jiwoo. Yes, she said carefully. Someone thought he could control our lives by making us afraid, so we left and built something better. Good, Michael said with the absolute certainty of a child who trusted his mother's decisions implicitly. I'm glad we're here. I like our life. She held him tighter, thinking about the years she'd spent in terror that Jiwoo would find them, that the syndicate's reach would somehow extend to London, and she'd wake up to armed men at her door. She'd changed their names legally, had used her father's connections to create documentation that would withstand scrutiny, had built a professional reputation under her new identity while keeping the most important part of her past, her son, completely hidden from public record. Michael King existed on paper as her nephew, adopted after her sister's tragic death. It was a thin fiction that wouldn't survive serious investigation, but it kept him out of databases and off social media, made him invisible to anyone searching for Seo Jiwoo's potential heirs. Because she knew Jiwoo would have looked, would have tried to confirm the miscarriage, would have maybe felt guilty enough to check that she was alive and surviving somewhere. She'd covered her tracks so thoroughly that even the syndicate's resources would find only dead ends and false trails leading nowhere. They had breakfast together, Michael eating with the careful manners she'd instilled, discussing the chess problem he'd been working on and asking if they could visit the British Museum later to see the Rosetta Stone again. He was obsessed with puzzles and codes, with understanding how things fit together, and she wondered sometimes if he'd inherited that analytical mind from his father, or if it was just coincidence that he could look at complex problems and see patterns nobody else noticed. Her phone buzzed with an email from the Victoria and Albert Museum, a new contract offer for a major project involving Korean antiquities that had been illegally exported during the colonial period. The attached file mentioned significant syndicate involvement in the Provenance Trail, shell companies in Seoul that had moved artifacts through private collections before they surfaced in European auctions. Christiana stared at the email for a long time, her coffee going cold in her hands. 7 years she'd spent building this new life, building her reputation, building her son into a person she was desperately proud of. 7 years of running, hiding, rebuilding from the ashes of what Jiwoo had destroyed. But reading that email, seeing the name Seoul and Korean syndicate operations in the same paragraph, she felt something shift inside her chest. Something sharp and dangerous that had been sleeping finally waking up. She'd been a victim once, had fled in terror with nothing but her unborn child and her father's emergency money, but she wasn't that girl anymore. She was Dr. Christiana Vale, expert in exposing criminal networks, specialist in tracking stolen property back to its source. And the syndicate had been stealing and hoarding Korean cultural artifacts for decades. "Mama," Michael asked, noticing her expression, "are you okay?" Christiana looked at her son, this brilliant, kind, observant boy who would never know his father's cruelty, who would never be infected by that world's poison, and made a decision that had been brewing in her subconscious for 7 years. "I'm perfect, baby," she said, opening the email and typing a response accepting the contract. "Mama just got offered a very important job. We might need to travel soon." "Where?" Michael asked, excited at the prospect of adventure. "Home," Christiana said, though Seoul had stopped feeling like home the night she'd fled it. "We're going to Korea. There's something Mama needs to take back." She didn't specify what she was taking back. Wasn't sure herself if she meant the artifacts or her dignity or the 7 years Jiwoo had stolen from her when he'd put that envelope in her hands and threatened everyone she loved. But sitting there with her son eating breakfast and the morning light streaming through windows she'd purchased with money she'd earned through her own brilliance and determination, Christiana finally felt the last piece of ice around her heart crack open. The phoenix had learned to fly. Now it was time to teach the dragon what it felt like to burn. The National Museum of Korean Heritage stood like a monument to legitimacy in the heart of Seoul's financial district, its glass facade reflecting clouds and the glittering towers of new money that surrounded it. Christiana stood on the marble steps with her briefcase in one hand and Michael's hand in the other, staring at the building that had been funded by 3 shell corporations she'd already traced back to the Beak Paw Syndicate. The museum director didn't know he'd built his institution with blood money. Or maybe he did know and simply didn't care, the way people in this city had perfected the art of not seeing what fed them. "It's beautiful," Michael said, his 7-year-old eyes wide as he took in the architecture. "Can we go inside?" "Soon," Christiana promised, though her stomach was twisted into knots that made breathing difficult. "Mama has to meet with some people first. You're going to stay with grandmother and grandfather today, remember." Her parents had wept when she'd called to say she was coming home, had asked 1,000 questions she couldn't answer over the phone about where she'd been and why she'd disappeared so completely. The reunion yesterday had been painful and healing in equal measure, her mother's hands shaking as she held Michael, her father's eyes bright with tears as he looked at the grandson he'd helped smuggle out of the country 7 years ago. They'd moved to a smaller house in a quieter neighborhood, had scaled back their careers after receiving anonymous threats that had mysteriously stopped the moment Christiana left Seoul. They knew enough about what had happened to never ask for details, and she loved them for understanding that some stories were too dangerous to tell out loud. Michael was already bonding with them, was spending the day learning to make kimchi and being spoiled by grandparents who'd thought they'd never get this chance, which left Christiana free to walk into the museum and begin the systematic destruction of everything Seo Jiwoo had built in the 7 years since he'd threatened to burn her family alive. The museum director was a nervous man named Dr. Yoon, who clearly knew his institution's funding came from questionable sources, but had convinced himself that art transcended its provenance. He showed her the galleries with obvious pride: Korean ceramics from the Joseon dynasty, Buddhist sculptures, ancient texts and paintings that represented centuries of cultural heritage. All of it beautiful, most of it stolen. "We're hosting a gala tomorrow night," Dr. Yoon said as they walked through the main exhibition hall. "Our major donors will be attending. It would be an honor if you join us, Dr. Vale. Your reputation precedes you, and having someone of your stature present would demonstrate our commitment to ethical acquisition practices." Christiana smiled the way she'd learned to smile in boardrooms and courtrooms, the expression that looked warm but contained nothing except calculation. "I'd be delighted to attend. I'm always interested in meeting the people who fund cultural institutions." Dr. Yoon looked relieved, not realizing he just invited a bomb into his carefully constructed fiction. The gala was black tie, held in the museum's soaring atrium beneath a ceiling that featured a massive installation of traditional Korean lanterns. Christiana arrived alone, dressed in a cream-colored gown that she'd had tailored in London, structured silk that moved like water, the neckline cut high and severe, her hair pulled back in a style that emphasized the elegant line of her neck, and the diamond earrings that cost more than her first year's salary at the Seoul Museum, where she'd met Jiwoo a lifetime ago. She'd transformed herself deliberately, had built armor out of education and wealth, and the kind of confidence that came from knowing exactly how dangerous you were. The room was full of Seoul's elite, politicians and CEOs, old money and new criminals wearing expensive suits. She recognized several faces from the business news, a few from her research into the syndicate's operations. And then, across the room near a display of Goryeo Celadon pottery, she saw him. Seo Jiwoo stood with a small group of men in tailored tuxedos, his dark hair styled perfectly, his posture radiating the kind of authority that made people instinctively give him space. He looked older than she remembered, harder, the lines around his eyes deeper, his mouth set in an expression that suggested he'd forgotten how to smile. He was listening to something one of the men was saying, his attention focused elsewhere, and Christiana felt her heart start hammering against her ribs with a violence that surprised her. 7 years. 7 years of rebuilding herself, of raising their son, of preparing for this moment. And now that it was here, now that she was standing 50 feet away from the man who'd destroyed her, she felt a complicated rush of emotion that had no business existing, rage and grief, and something terrifyingly close to the love she thought she'd killed. As if sensing her stare, Jiwoo turned his head, and their eyes met across the crowded room. She watched him freeze, watched the color drain from his face, Watched recognition hit him like a physical blow. His glass of champagne stopped halfway to his mouth, his entire body going rigid with shock. The men around him kept talking, oblivious to the fact that their dragon head had just seen a ghost. Christiana held his gaze for 3 seconds, long enough to let him know she wasn't afraid, that she'd come here deliberately, that this wasn't an accident. Then turned away to accept a glass of wine from a passing server, her hand perfectly steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. She made it 15 minutes before he cornered her in the gallery featuring Buddhist manuscripts, moving with the predatory grace she remembered, his presence filling the space until she could barely breathe. Up close, she could see the changes 7 years had carved into him, the silver threading through his hair at the temples, the shadows under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, the way he held himself like a man who'd won every battle and lost every war that mattered. Christiana. Her name came out rough, like he'd forgotten how to say it properly. How are you here? She turned to face him fully, letting him see what she'd become. Letting him take in the expensive dress, the confident posture, the way she looked at him now without any trace of the girl who'd once loved him. Dr. Vale, actually, I don't use that name professionally. Dr. Vale, he repeated, and she could see him processing, trying to understand. The art restitution expert. You've been the one tracking our acquisitions for the past 3 years. Your acquisitions, Christiana corrected, her voice pleasant and cold as winter. The syndicate's stolen cultural heritage that you've been laundering through legitimate institutions. Yes, that would be me. I've become quite good at following money trails and exposing criminal networks. I wonder where I learned those skills. Jiwoo's jaw clenched, his hands flexing at his sides like he wanted to reach for her but knew better. Where have you been? I looked for you, sent people to every city, checked every hospital record, every morgue, Christiana finished. How thorough of you. Tell me, did you check those before or after you married Akiko Nakamura? The hit landed, and she saw him flinch. That marriage it wasn't about. I don't care, Christiana interrupted, and meant it with every cell in her body. I didn't come here to discuss your personal life, Mr. CEO. I came here in my professional capacity. The museum has hired me to audit the provenance of every piece in their collection, and I'm afraid I've found some disturbing irregularities. She opened her clutch and pulled out a folded document, pressing it into his hands with the same clinical detachment he'd once used giving her that envelope of abortion money. This is a legal notice informing you that 17 artifacts currently displayed in this museum have been traced back to illegal excavations and trafficking operations connected to the Beak Paw Syndicate. Interpol has been notified, as have several international cultural heritage organizations. The investigation is ongoing, but I thought you'd want to know that your money laundering scheme is about to become very public. Jiwoo stared at the document like it was written in a language he couldn't read, his face going through expressions too fast to catalog, shock, anger, something that might have been hurt if she'd been willing to give him credit for having feelings. You're doing this because of what happened between us. This is revenge. Christiana laughed, a sound that held no humor whatsoever. This isn't revenge, Jiwoo. This is my job. I recover stolen cultural heritage and expose the criminals who traffic in it. The fact that you happen to be one of those criminals is just a fortunate coincidence. Though I'll admit, there's a certain poetic justice in dismantling the empire you chose over your own. She stopped herself, the word "son" dying on her lips before she could make that mistake. But Jiwoo had gone very still, his eyes sharpening with the intelligence that had made him dangerous. Over my own what? He asked quietly. What were you going to say? Over your own humanity, Christiana finished, stepping back to put distance between them. Over any chance you had it being something other than your father's legacy. But you made your choice 7 years ago when you threatened to burn my parents alive to protect your precious alliance. You don't get to question my choices now. I was trying to protect you, Jiwoo said, and there was something raw in his voice that she couldn't afford to acknowledge. The elders would have killed you if they'd known about, if they'd discovered. If they discovered what? Christiana demanded, her voice rising despite her intention to stay calm. Say it, Jiwoo. If they discovered that your girlfriend was pregnant, that you'd created a complication that threatened your strategic marriage, you were so busy protecting your empire that you never stopped to think there might be another option. You never considered walking away from it all, choosing something real over something built on violence and fear. I couldn't walk away, Jiwoo said, and for the first time since she'd known him, he sounded helpless. Don't you understand? They would have hunted me down, would have killed everyone I cared about to send a message. Leaving wasn't an option. Then you should have let me make my own choice instead of forcing my hand, Christiana said, and pulled out her phone to check the time with deliberate casualness. But this conversation is pointless. What happened between us is ancient history. The legal notice is current. You have 72 hours to provide documentation proving legitimate acquisition of the artifacts in question, or the authorities will assume they were obtained illegally and act accordingly. She started to walk past him, done with this confrontation, but his hand caught her wrist, not hard enough to hurt, but firm enough to stop her. The touch sent electricity up her arm, muscle memory of all the times he'd pulled her clothes, and she yanked free like she'd been burned. Don't touch me, she said, her voice shaking with rage she'd kept buried for 7 years. You lost that right when you put your hands on my stomach and told me to eliminate the problem. You lost every right to touch me, speak to me, or exist in my presence. Stay away from me, Jiwoo. Or I promise, what I've done to your museum funding will seem gentle compared to what comes next. She walked away before he could respond, her heels clicking against marble with the sharp precision of gunfire. She didn't look back, didn't let herself acknowledge the way her hands were trembling or the tears threatening to spill over. She'd done what she came here to do, had looked him in the eye and shown him she'd survived, had thrived, had become someone powerful enough to hurt him the way he'd hurt her. But driving back to her parents' house where Michael was sleeping peacefully, unaware that his father was 20 minutes away and spiraling into chaos, Christiana finally let herself cry. Because seeing Jiwoo had broken something open that she'd thought she'd sealed shut forever, had reminded her that love doesn't die cleanly, that some wounds never fully heal, that 7 years wasn't nearly long enough to forget the man who'd chosen his empire over their unborn child. She parked in the driveway and sat in the darkness, pressing her palms against her eyes until the crying stopped. Then she walked inside, checked on Michael sleeping peacefully in the guest room, and finally let herself feel the weight of what she'd set in motion. The dragon had seen the phoenix. And now, finally, the real battle could begin. Jiwoo didn't sleep for 3 days after the gala, his mind circling obsessively around the impossible fact of Christiana's return and the legal notice that threatened to expose operations he'd spent years legitimizing. His lawyers were already scrambling to manufacture provenance documentation, his accountants working overtime to create paper trails that would satisfy international scrutiny. But none of that mattered as much as the look in Christiana's eyes when she'd handed him that notice, cold, confident, and utterly devoid of the fear he'd seen the last time they'd spoken. She'd transformed into someone he barely recognized, someone dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with violence and everything to do with systematic, legal destruction. Dr. Christiana Vale. He'd been tracking her professional reputation for 3 years without ever connecting the dots, without realizing the woman dismantling art trafficking networks across Europe was the same girl he'd threatened into silence in his office. The irony was brutal. He'd created his own worst enemy by teaching her exactly how his world operated. He told himself he was having her followed for business reasons, to understand her investigation and protect syndicate interests. But the truth was darker and more desperate. He needed to know where she was, needed to confirm she was real and not some guilt-induced hallucination his exhausted mind had conjured. He assigned his best surveillance team with explicit instructions. Watch, but don't approach. Document her movements. Report everything. The first reports were mundane. She was staying with her parents in their modest house in Seongbukdong, working from a home office, meeting with museum officials and lawyers. She moved through the city with the confidence of someone who'd shed every trace of vulnerability, who walked into rooms full of powerful men and made them nervous instead of the reverse. His team photographed her at cafes and galleries, always alone, always focused, never showing any sign that she knew she was being watched. Then came the report that stopped his heart. Subject picked up a minor from Seoul International Academy at 3:47 p.m. Male child, approximately 6-7 years old. Subject displayed obvious maternal behavior, physical affection, hand-holding, conversation during walk to vehicle. Relationship appears to be guardian or parent. Jiwoo stared at the words until they stopped making sense, his brain refusing to process what they implied. A child. Christiana had a child. The photographs were attached, grainy long-distance shots of her kneeling to adjust a small boy's backpack, holding his hand as they crossed the street, laughing at something he'd said. The boy's face wasn't clear in those images, just a blur of dark hair and a school uniform. But something about his posture, the way he held himself even at that young age, sent ice through Jiwoo's veins. He gave new orders. Focus on the child, get better photographs, find out everything. The next report arrived 24 hours later with images that made Jiwoo's hands shake so badly he had to set his phone down on the desk and stare at it from a distance, as if physical space could change what he was seeing. The boy was standing outside the school holding a book, something thick and serious, completely inappropriate for a 7-year-old, his small face set in an expression of intense concentration. He wore his uniform with precise care, his dark hair neatly combed, his posture straight despite the heavy backpack. And when one of the surveillance photos caught him looking directly at the camera, unaware he was being photographed, Jiwoo saw his own face staring back at him from across 25 years and an impossible distance. The same eyes, the same severe mouth, the same way of holding his head slightly tilted when analyzing something. Even the boy's hands, visible in one close-up shot as he turned a page, were shaped exactly like Jiwoo's, long fingers, broad palms, the distinctive way the thumb curved. The report included the child's name, Michael King, age 7, enrolled at Seoul International Academy 3 weeks ago after transferring from a private school in London. Mother listed as Christiana Vale. Father, unknown. Jiwoo sat in his office with those photographs spread across his desk like evidence of a crime, and felt his entire understanding of reality crack apart. 7 years ago, Christiana had called him from a hospital and told him the pregnancy was over. He'd believed her because he'd needed to believe her, because accepting that he'd forced her to abort their child was easier than acknowledging what he'd become. He'd buried the guilt and the grief and told himself he'd saved her life, that she'd moved on somewhere safe and eventually forgiven him. But she'd lied. She'd faked the miscarriage and disappeared with his child, had raised his son in another country under another name, had built an entire life specifically designed to exclude him. And now she'd brought the boy back to Seoul, was enrolling him in school 15 minutes from syndicate headquarters, was letting Jiwoo's son exist in the same city without any intention of telling him. The betrayal felt like drowning. The rage felt like burning. But underneath both was something more terrifying, a desperate, aching need to see the boy in person, to confirm that he was real and healthy and everything the photographs suggested. Jiwoo left his office without telling anyone where he was going, drove himself to Seoul International Academy, and parked across the street at 3:30 p.m. to wait for the dismissal bell. His security team was probably panicking about his unannounced departure, but he didn't care. Nothing mattered except the small boy who carried his face and his blood and apparently none of his knowledge. The children started emerging at 3:45, a flood of expensive uniforms and designer backpacks. Jiwoo scanned each face with the intensity of someone searching for a bomb, his heart hammering against his ribs hard enough to hurt. And then he saw him, Michael King, walking out with 2 other boys, laughing at something, his face bright with the kind of unself-conscious joy Jiwoo couldn't remember ever feeling. Up close, the resemblance was devastating. The boy had Christiana's warm brown skin and gentler features, but the bone structure was pure Seo, strong jaw, high cheekbones, the distinctive line of his nose. He moved with unconscious grace, his gestures precise and controlled even in play. When one of his friends stumbled, Michael's hand shot out to steady him with reflexes that seemed too fast for a 7-year-old. Then Christiana appeared, walking up to the school gate in jeans and a simple sweater, looking nothing like the polished professional from the gala, and everything like the girl Jiwoo had loved. Michael's entire face transformed when he saw her, lighting up with pure adoration as he ran toward her and launched himself into her arms. She caught him easily, laughing, and Jiwoo watched her bury her face in the boy's hair with the kind of fierce love that made his chest ache. "Mama, guess what?" Michael was saying as they walked toward the parking area, close enough now that Jiwoo could hear their conversation through his partially open window. "I solved Mr. Han's logic puzzle in 12 minutes. He said most adults can't do it in under 20. Of course you did, Christiana said, pride evident in her voice. You're brilliant, just like... She stopped abruptly, and Jiwoo saw her eyes scan the street with sudden wariness, as if sensing danger. Her gaze landed on his car, on him sitting frozen behind the wheel, and he watched her face go pale with recognition and fury. She said something sharp to Michael, who looked confused, and then she was walking toward Jiwoo's car with Michael's hand gripped tightly in hers, her expression promising violence. Jiwoo got out of the car because staying inside felt cowardly, because he needed to stand at his full height when facing what he'd done. Christiana stopped 10 feet away, positioning herself between him and Michael, her body language screaming protection. Leave, she said quietly, her voice shaking with rage. Right now, or I call the police and report a strange man stalking children outside a school. Is he mine? Jiwoo asked, and his voice came out hoarse, destroyed. Christiana, is that boy is Michael. You don't get to ask me that, Christiana interrupted. You don't get to have this conversation. You gave up every right to information about my son when you threatened to burn my family alive if I didn't abort him. Behind her, Michael was watching the exchange with the kind of sharp attention that suggested he understood more than a 7-year-old should. His eyes, Jiwoo's eyes, studied his father's face with unsettling intensity, taking in details, analyzing, calculating. You lied to me, Jiwoo said, and knew how absurd it sounded. How dare he claim betrayal when he'd been the one to issue threats? You told me the pregnancy was over. I told you what I needed to tell you to escape, Christiana said. Did you really think I'd let you force me to kill my child? Did you honestly believe I'd choose your empire over my son's life? Our son, Jiwoo corrected, taking a step forward. Christiana moved back immediately, pulling Michael with her. No, my son, mine, you're nothing to him, you're nobody. A stranger in a parking lot who doesn't understand boundaries. I'm his father, Jiwoo said, and the words felt like ripping his chest open and exposing everything inside. That's my face he's wearing. Those are my hands. When he tilts his head like that, analyzing, that's me. You can't erase biology, Christiana. I can erase you, she shot back. I've done it for 7 years. Michael doesn't know your name, doesn't know what you are or what you've done. And he never will because I made sure my son never knew a monster like you. The word, monster, landed like a blade between his ribs. Jiwoo looked at his son, this beautiful, brilliant boy who watched him with curiosity but no recognition, no connection, no understanding that they shared blood and features and a history that had been deliberately erased. Mama, who is that man? Michael asked, his voice carrying clearly in the afternoon air. Nobody, baby, Christiana said, but her eyes never left Jiwoo's face. Just someone who made a mistake coming here. He looks sad, Michael observed with the blunt honesty of childhood. And familiar. Do we know him from somewhere? Jiwoo's throat closed completely. The boy had seen it, had recognized something in his face despite never being told, despite Christiana's best efforts to hide the connection. Genetics didn't lie. Blood called to blood even when love had been systematically destroyed. Get in the car, Michael, Christiana said, her voice tight with fear poorly disguised as authority. But Mama... Now Michael King. The use of his full name made the boy move immediately, walking to their parked car with obvious reluctance, looking back over his shoulder at Jiwoo with an expression that suggested he was filing this encounter away for later analysis. Smart kid. Observant. Everything Jiwoo had been at that age before the syndicate taught him that intelligence without ruthlessness was weakness. Once Michael was in the car with the door closed, Christiana turned back to Jiwoo with murder in her eyes. If you come near my son again, I will destroy you. Not the way you threatened to destroy my family. I'll do it legally, systematically, publicly. Every shell corporation, every laundered dollar, every artifact you've stolen. I'll expose it all and watch you burn. Do you understand me? Let me know him, Jiwoo said, and hated how desperate he sounded, how far he'd fallen from the dragon head who negotiated with governments and crushed rivals without mercy. Please, I'm not asking for custody or rights or just let me know him. Let him know I exist. Why? Christiana demanded. So you can teach him that power matters more than people, so he can learn to threaten pregnant women and burn innocent families. What exactly do you think you have to offer my son except corruption and violence? I don't know, Jiwoo admitted, and felt something inside him break completely. I don't know what I can offer him except the truth that I exist, that I didn't know about him, that if I had known. If you had known what? Christiana asked. You would have made the same choice you always make. Power over love, empire over family. You can't rewrite history, Jiwoo. You showed me exactly who you are and I believed you. Michael is alive because I didn't. She walked to her car without waiting for a response, got in, and drove away with his son strapped in the backseat, turning to look back at Jiwoo through the rear window with those devastatingly familiar eyes full of questions nobody would answer. Jiwoo stood in the parking lot long after they'd disappeared, surrounded by other parents picking up their children, and finally understood the full cost of the choice he'd made 7 years ago. He'd traded a family for an empire, love for power, and inherited nothing except isolation and regret. He had a son, a brilliant, beautiful 7-year-old boy who didn't know his name, who looked at him like a stranger, who would grow up believing his father was nobody because his mother had decided that even nothing was better than what Jiwoo had to offer. And the worst part, the part that made him want to tear his own empire down with his bare hands, was that Christiana was absolutely right. The syndicate operated on instinct the way sharks sensed blood, any sign of weakness, any hint of distraction, and the predators started circling. Jiwoo had built his reputation on being untouchable, on making decisions with cold calculation that never wavered, on treating every threat with immediate and overwhelming force. But in the week since he'd seen Michael standing outside that school with his face and Christiana's protective fury, he'd been somewhere else entirely. Present physically in meetings, but absent where it mattered, his mind replaying the boy's voice asking, "Do we know him from somewhere?" On an endless, torturous loop. The elders noticed. They always noticed. Old Man Choi called an emergency council, meeting on a Wednesday afternoon, summoning the inner circle to the private room at the back of the restaurant the syndicate had owned for 40 years. Jiwoo arrived to find them already assembled, Choi with his calculating smile, Director H. Wang looking concerned, Lady Min watching him with the sharp attention of someone cataloging weaknesses for future exploitation. And sitting in the chair that should have been empty, uninvited and radiating smug confidence, was Daniel Kwon. The Viper, that's what they called him in the organization, though never to his face. He'd been Jiwoo's father's lieutenant before losing a power struggle when Jiwoo took over, had been demoted to managing the gambling operations in Busan, and had spent the past 7 years quietly building alliances and waiting for an opportunity to strike. He was 43, handsome in a dangerous way, with expensive suits that couldn't quite hide the violence coiled underneath. And he was smiling at Jiwoo, with the satisfaction of someone who'd just drawn a winning hand. "Daniel," Jiwoo said evenly, taking his seat at the head of the table and refusing to acknowledge the breach of protocol. "I don't recall inviting you to this meeting." "The elders thought my input might be valuable," Daniel replied, his tone respectful but his eyes promising war. "Given the current complications affecting leadership focus." Jiwoo's blood went cold. "What complications?" Lady Min folded her hands on the table, her rings glittering in the low light. "You've been distracted, Jiwoo. Missing meetings, making uncharacteristic mistakes, disappearing without informing security. In our world, distraction is lethal. We need to understand what's compromising your judgment." "Nothing is compromising my judgment," Jiwoo said, but even he could hear how the lie sounded. Hollow, defensive, exactly the kind of weakness that got people killed in his position. "Then perhaps you can explain the woman," Director H. Wang said, sliding a folder across the table. "Dr. Christiana Vale, the art expert who's systematically exposing our acquisition operations. Our intelligence suggests you have a personal history with her, that you've been conducting unauthorized surveillance, that you approached her outside a school last week in broad daylight without security." Jiwoo didn't open the folder, didn't need to see what they'd compiled. Photographs of him sitting in his car watching the school, images of Christiana and Michael walking to their vehicle, evidence of the surveillance team he'd thought was discreet. The syndicate had eyes everywhere, including on him. He'd been foolish to think otherwise. "I'm handling the situation," Jiwoo said. "Are you?" Daniel asked, and pulled out his phone, swiping to an image that made Jiwoo's heart stop. It was Michael, captured in clear detail outside the school, his face fully visible, unmistakably bearing Jiwoo's features. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you have a significant vulnerability that you've kept hidden from the organization. A child. Your child, unless I'm very much mistaken. 7 years old, which means he was conceived right around the time of your marriage negotiations with the Nakamura family. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Jiwoo watched the elders' expressions shift from concern to calculation, saw them reassessing everything they thought they knew about his past. Old Man Choi's smile had turned predatory. Lady Min's eyes held the kind of interest that preceded elimination orders. The boy is none of the syndicate's concern, Jiwoo said, keeping his voice level through sheer force of will. He's not part of this world. His mother left the country 7 years ago. They only recently returned for her work. There's no connection to our operations. No connection? Daniel laughed, the sound sharp and ugly. He's your son, Jiwoo. He's your blood. In our world, that makes him leverage. That makes him a weapon. And the fact that you've hidden his existence suggests you understand exactly how valuable he could be in the wrong hands. If anyone touches that child, Jiwoo started, then stopped himself, realizing too late that he just confirmed everything they suspected. There it is, Daniel said softly. The distraction, the weakness. 7 years ago, you were willing to do anything for the syndicate. Now you're making threats to protect some woman's bastard. This is exactly the kind of compromised leadership that destroys organizations. Jiwoo stood slowly, his hands flat on the table, channeling every ounce of authority he'd accumulated into his voice. That child and his mother are off limits, completely. Anyone who violates that directive answers to me personally. Are we clear? Perfectly clear, Daniel said, still smiling. You're willing to prioritize personal feelings over organizational security. The elders should find that very informative when they're considering succession planning. The meeting dissolved into tense discussion about other business, but Jiwoo barely heard it. His mind was racing through scenarios, calculating risks, understanding with sick certainty that he just painted a target on Michael's back by trying to protect him. Daniel would use the boy to undermine Jiwoo's position, would orchestrate something that forced Jiwoo to choose between his son and his power, would prove to the elders that sentiment made him unfit to lead. He left the restaurant and immediately called his head of security. I need a team on Dr. Christiana Vale and her son. 24-hour surveillance and protection. Discreet but comprehensive. Nobody gets within 50 feet of them without going through our people first. Sir, that's going to be expensive and obvious. If she notices. I don't care what it costs, Jiwoo interrupted. And I don't care if she notices. Keep them safe. That's the only priority. He deployed 8 guards, 4 on 12-hour shifts, rotating positions around Christiana's parents' house, following at a distance when she drove anywhere, maintaining watch outside Michael's school. Professional, trained, armed, and completely useless the moment Christiana realized what was happening. She called the police on the second day, standing in her parents' driveway with her phone pressed to her ear, and her eyes locked on the sedan parked across the street with 2 of Jiwoo's men inside. Her voice carried clearly through the open windows as she reported suspicious individuals loitering near a residential area with a child present, described the vehicle, provided the license plate number. The guards received the abort signal and pulled back, but Christiana wasn't finished. She called Jiwoo directly, her voice shaking with fury when he answered. Call them off, she said without preamble. Right now, or I don't just call the police, I call reporters. I hold a press conference about how the Beak Paw Syndicate is harassing a single mother and stalking a 7-year-old child. See how your legitimate business interests survive that publicity. They're there to protect you, Jiwoo said, packing his office like a caged animal. Something's happened. There are people in the organization who know about Michael, who might try to use him to get to me. I need to know you're safe. We were safe, Christiana shot back. We were perfectly safe for 7 years until you found us. Every danger Michael faces now exists because you couldn't leave us alone. Because you had to come to that school, had to make yourself visible, had to drag us into your world. I didn't know he existed, Jiwoo said, and heard how pathetic it sounded. If I had known. You would have what? Been a father? Chosen us over your empire? Don't insult my intelligence. You made your choice 7 years ago. The only difference is now you feel guilty about it, and you think throwing guards at the problem will fix what you broke. Christiana, please listen to me. There's a man named Daniel Kwon. He's a rival within the syndicate, and he's discovered Michael's existence. He's going to try something. I don't know what yet, but in my world, children are leverage. They're weapons. I need to protect my son. Your son? Christiana's laugh was bitter and sharp. Michael is my son, mine. The one I carried and birthed and raised while you were building your criminal empire. You don't get to claim him now that it's convenient. You don't get to use him as an excuse to station armed gangsters outside his home. Then what do you want me to do? Jiwoo demanded, his voice raw with desperation. Just watch while someone tries to hurt him. Do nothing while my enemies figure out that the fastest way to destroy me is through a 7-year-old boy. I want you to disappear, Christiana said. I want you to go back to pretending we don't exist. Every minute you're in our lives, you make us less safe. Your protection is the danger, Jiwoo. You are the threat. She hung up before he could respond, and when Jiwoo tried to call back, she'd blocked his number. Christiana is refusing help because trust is earned, not bought. If you think Jiwoo deserves the silent treatment after what he did, comment, too little too late. Let's show him that money can't fix a broken heart. That night, Jiwoo sat in his penthouse surrounded by security reports and surveillance photos, trying to find a way to protect his son without his son's mother's permission, without making things worse, without proving Christiana right about every terrible thing she believed about him. His head of security suggested remote surveillance, drones, long-range cameras, digital monitoring that wouldn't require obvious physical presence. But even that felt like a violation, like he was turning Michael into a target just by caring whether he lived or died. His phone rang at 2 a.m., Daniel Kwon, calling from an untraceable number. Lovely family you have, Daniel said conversationally. The boy looks just like you, smart too from what I hear, reads at a high school level, solves puzzles that stump adults. That kind of intelligence is valuable. Imagine what someone could do with a mind like that, properly trained, properly motivated. Jiwoo's blood turned to ice. If you touch him. I'm not going to touch him, Daniel interrupted. But I know where he goes to school. I know his route home. I know his mother takes him to the British Museum Annex on Saturday mornings and the park on Sunday afternoons. I know everything about your son, Jiwoo, and so does anyone else willing to pay for the information. The line went dead. Jiwoo stood at his window, staring out at the city that had once felt like his kingdom and now felt like a prison. He'd spent 7 years building an empire, consolidating power, becoming untouchable. And it had taken Daniel Kwon less than a week to find the one thing that could bring him to his knees, a 7-year-old boy with his face who didn't know his name. Christiana had been right about everything. His presence in their lives was the danger. His world was the threat. And there was no way to protect Michael without admitting that the best thing Jiwoo could do for his son was exactly what Christiana had demanded, disappear completely, and hope that without obvious connection, Daniel would lose interest. But Jiwoo had never been good at doing the right thing when it required sacrifice. He'd chosen power over love once, had spent 7 years living with that decision. And now, faced with the same impossible choice, his empire or his son's safety, he found himself frozen, unable to walk away, unable to do what needed to be done. The dragon head was paralyzed by the one thing he'd never learned to fight. Love for something more important than himself. Christiana had taught Michael the rules of survival the way other mothers taught their children to look both ways before crossing the street. Run first, scream second, never let anyone separate you from her. Fight dirty if you have to, eyes, throat, groin, and don't stop moving until you find help. She'd made it into a game when he was younger, practicing scenarios in their London flat until Michael could execute an escape plan without thinking. She told herself it was reasonable caution, preparation for a dangerous world, not paranoia born from knowing exactly what kind of monster she'd loved. She'd never actually believed she'd need those rules, had convinced herself that 7 years and an ocean of distance had made them safe, that Jiwoo's world couldn't reach across that much time and space to hurt them. Even after returning to Seoul, even after Jiwoo had found them, she'd believed her anger and her boundaries would be enough to keep the darkness at bay. She'd been catastrophically wrong. It was Sunday afternoon, the park near the Han River filled with families enjoying the autumn weather. Christiana sat on a bench reading through provenance documents while Michael played on the climbing structure with two boys he'd befriended at school. She could see him from where she sat, his dark head visible among the other children, his laughter carrying across the playground. Safe, visible, protected by daylight and witnesses, and the reasonable assumption that violence didn't happen in parks on Sunday afternoons. She noticed the van first, white, unmarked, parked too close to the playground entrance with its engine running, wrong enough to make her look up from her papers to start cataloging details the way Jiwoo had once taught her to assess threats. The driver's face was obscured by sunglasses. The side door was slightly open, and there were 3 men standing near the climbing structure who didn't have children with them, who were watching Michael with the focused attention of people executing a plan. Christiana was on her feet and moving before conscious thought kicked in, her papers scattering in the wind as she sprinted toward the playground. She saw the moment the men realized she'd noticed them, saw their body language shift from casual observation to urgent action. The tallest one moved toward Michael with predatory speed, reaching for the boy who was climbing down from the structure, completely unaware of the danger. "Michael, run!" Christiana screamed and blessed her son's instant obedience, his trust in her voice even when he didn't understand why. Michael's head snapped toward her, took in her expression, and he was running before the man's hand could close on his shoulder, dropping through the climbing structure's bars with agility that came from being small and fast and terrified. The man lunged after him, but Christiana reached them first, throwing herself between the stranger and her son with fury that turned her vision red. She'd learned to fight from her father, who'd grown up in rough neighborhoods and believed his daughter should know how to protect herself. She'd never used those skills in real life, had never needed to until this moment when everything she loved was being threatened. She went for the eyes first, her nails raking across the man's face hard enough to draw blood. He reeled back with a curse, and Christiana used the opening to grab Michael's hand and pull him behind her, backing toward the crowded part of the park where people were starting to notice the commotion. But the other 2 men were closing in, moving to flank them, and the van was rolling forward, positioning itself to cut off their escape route. "Run to the cafe," Christiana told Michael, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. "Find an adult. Call grandmother. Don't stop for anything." Michael hesitated, 7 years old and already too brave, his small hands clutching at her jacket. "I'm not leaving you." "Now, Michael King," Christiana shouted, using his full name the way she did when obedience wasn't optional, and finally, he ran, his small legs pumping as he sprinted toward the cafe at the park entrance where families sat at outdoor tables drinking coffee. One of the men broke away to chase him, and Christiana made a choice that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She turned and ran in the opposite direction, drawing the other 2 men after her, trusting that Michael's speed and the crowd would keep him safe. She ran toward the river path where there were joggers and cyclists, where people would intervene, where she could scream for help without risking her son. She almost made it, was 10 feet from a group of runners when something hit her from behind, sending her sprawling onto the concrete path. Pain exploded through her shoulder and hip, but she rolled immediately, lashing out with her feet the way her father had taught her, connecting with someone's knee hard enough to hear a satisfying crack and a howl of pain. Then there were hands grabbing her arms, hauling her upright, and a voice in her ear speaking Korean with a Busan accent. "Stop fighting. The boy's already in the van. You want to see him again, you come quietly." The words stopped her resistance more effectively than any physical force. Michael. They had Michael. Christiana's vision tunneled, her body going cold with a terror so profound she couldn't breathe. She let them drag her toward the white van, her mind racing through scenarios, calculating odds, preparing to do whatever was necessary to get to her son. But when they reached the van and the side door slid open, Michael wasn't inside. Instead, there was chaos. The sound of police sirens in the distance, people shouting, and the man who'd chased Michael returning empty-handed, his face bloodied and furious. "The kid got away," he was saying. "Little bastard bit me and ran straight into a crowd, started screaming about kidnappers, the whole cafe's calling the cops." Relief hit Christiana so hard she almost collapsed. Michael was safe. Michael had run. Her brilliant, brave boy had done exactly what she'd taught him, had survived because she'd prepared him for this nightmare. The men were arguing now, their plan falling apart, sirens getting closer. They shoved Christiana away with enough force to send her stumbling, and the van was peeling out of the parking lot before she could get the license plate number, leaving her alone on the path with her clothes torn and blood streaming from a cut above her eyebrow. She ran back toward the cafe on shaking legs, pushing through the crowd that had gathered, searching frantically for Michael's small face. She found him surrounded by concerned adults, his cheeks wet with tears, his hands trembling but his voice steady as he gave a description to a police officer who'd arrived on scene. "Mama!" Michael broke away the moment he saw her, launching himself into her arms with enough force to nearly knock her over. She caught him, held him against her chest, and felt something fundamental inside her break. She'd brought them back to Seoul. She'd underestimated the danger. She'd believed her anger at Jiwoo would be enough to protect them from his world, and she'd been wrong, and her son had nearly paid the price. "You're okay," she whispered against his hair, checking him frantically for injuries. "Baby, are you okay? Are you hurt?" "My arm," Michael said, and when she pulled back to look, she saw blood seeping through his torn sleeve. Not a lot, but enough to make her stomach turn. A gash across his forearm, probably from scraping against the climbing structure bars when he dropped through them to escape. The paramedics arrived and insisted on checking them both. Michael sat stoically while they cleaned and bandaged his arm, his eyes finding Christiana's every few seconds to make sure she was still there. The cut wasn't deep enough for stitches, but it would scar, a permanent reminder of the day his father's world had tried to swallow him. Christiana gave her statement to the police with mechanical precision, describing the men, the van, the attempted abduction. The officers promised to investigate, to increase patrols, all the empty reassurances that meant nothing when the people trying to hurt her son operated outside the law. They took photos of her injuries, of Michael's arm, documenting evidence that would never lead to arrests because the syndicate owned half the police force. She drove home with Michael silent in the backseat, his eyes fixed on the window, his small body rigid with shock. Her parents met them at the door, her mother gasping at the sight of their injuries, her father's face going pale with understanding. He knew. He'd always known that coming back to Seoul was dangerous, that Jiwoo's world was a predator that never stopped hunting. Christiana got Michael cleaned up, fed him dinner he barely touched, and lay with him in bed until his breathing finally evened out into sleep. Then she sat in the hallway outside his room with her back against the wall and her phone in her shaking hands, staring at Jiwoo's blocked number. She unblocked it, called him at 11 p.m., knowing he'd answer, knowing he'd been waiting. "They tried to take him," she said when he picked up on the first ring. "Your people, your world. They tried to kidnap our son from a playground and he's 7 years old, Jiwoo. He's 7 and he has nightmares now, and he asked me if the bad men are coming back." The silence on the other end lasted so long she thought he'd hung up. Then, "Is he hurt?" "He has a cut on his arm, bruises, terror that will probably last the rest of his life. But sure, he's fine because at least he's not dead." "Where are you?" Jiwoo's voice had changed, dropped into something cold and lethal that she recognized from 7 years ago. "I'm coming." "No," Christiana interrupted. "You're not coming here, you're not coming near us. I called to tell you that you were right. Your presence in our lives is a death sentence. So congratulations, Jiwoo, you win. We're leaving. First flight back to London I can book. Michael and I are disappearing, and this time I'm making sure you never find us again." "Christiana, wait." She hung up and blocked his number again, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the phone. This was her fault, all of it. She'd come back to Seoul thinking she was strong enough, powerful enough, wealthy enough to face Jiwoo on equal ground. She thought her legal weapons and professional reputation would protect them from violence. She'd forgotten that in his world, violence was the only language that mattered. She'd forgotten that loving Seo Jiwoo, even 7 years ago, even briefly, had marked her and Michael for destruction. In his penthouse across the city, Jiwoo stood at his window with Christiana's words echoing in his skull. He's 7 years old, and felt something inside him die completely. He'd spent the day tracking Daniel Kwon, following leads, deploying resources to find out where the order had come from. He'd known something was coming but had underestimated the timeline, had believed he had more time to neutralize the threat before anyone moved on his son. He'd been wrong, and Michael had bled because of it. Jiwoo called his head of security with orders that came out cold and precise, emptied of everything except purpose. Find Daniel Kwon. Find everyone who was involved in today's incident. I don't care where they're hiding. I want locations within the hour. Then he walked out of his penthouse and into the night, and for the next 6 hours, Seo Jiwoo reminded Seoul exactly why people called him the Dragon. He tore through the city with surgical precision, hitting Daniel's operations one by one. The gambling house in Gangnam, the warehouse in Incheon, the nightclub that laundered money through VIP bottle service. He didn't kill anyone, though the temptation was overwhelming. Instead, he destroyed, burned businesses, seized assets, arrested key personnel through police he owned, and sent a message that echoed through the syndicate's networks. Touch my son and lose everything. He found Daniel at dawn in a safe house in Itaewon, surrounded by guards who scattered the moment Jiwoo walked through the door with 6 armed men behind him. Daniel tried to negotiate, tried to claim ignorance, tried to save himself with words. Jiwoo hit him once, a blow that shattered his jaw and sent him crashing through a glass coffee table, and delivered his message while Daniel choked on blood and broken teeth. You're out of the syndicate, out of Seoul, out of Korea. If I ever see you again, I'll kill you. If I ever hear you've spoken my son's name, I'll kill your entire family. Do you understand? Daniel nodded, his eyes bright with pain and understanding. Jiwoo left him there and drove to the compound where the elders were already gathered, having heard about his rampage through their networks. He walked into the conference room covered in someone else's blood, his knuckles split, his eyes holding the kind of emptiness that came from finally understanding what mattered. I'm done, he told them simply. Find another dragon head, I'm out. The infection started 36 hours after the park attack, a silent predator that turned a manageable cut into a medical emergency, while Christiana was frantically booking flights and packing their lives into suitcases. Michael had seemed fine that first night, shaken but resilient, asking careful questions about why people wanted to hurt them, accepting her simplified explanations with the trust of a child who believed his mother could protect him from anything. By Monday morning, he was feverish. By Monday evening, the skin around the bandaged cut had turned angry red, swollen with heat that radiated poison. Christiana's father took one look and insisted on the hospital. Seoul National University Hospital, where he still had privileges, where he could ensure Michael got the best care. They admitted him immediately, started IV antibiotics, ran blood cultures that came back showing an aggressive bacterial infection that wasn't responding to standard treatment. The doctors spoke in careful euphemisms about sepsis risk and immune response, but Christiana heard what they weren't saying. Her son was getting worse despite everything they were doing. By Tuesday morning, Michael's fever had spiked to 104 degrees, his small body shaking with chills despite the heated blankets. The attending physician, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, pulled Christiana into the hallway and delivered news that made the world tilt sideways. We need to do an exchange transfusion, Dr. Song said. Replace some of his blood with fresh donor blood to help clear the infection and support his immune system. The problem is Michael has a very rare blood type, Bombay phenotype. It's found in less than 0.0004% of the population. Our blood bank doesn't have it in stock, and the National Registry shows only 3 active donors in Korea. Christiana's medical knowledge was limited, but she understood odds and percentages well enough to know what Dr. Song was really saying. How long to locate a donor? We're already making calls, but it could take days, and Michael doesn't have days. His condition is deteriorating rapidly. If we can't find compatible blood in the next 12 hours, we'll have to try less optimal alternatives, which carry significant risks. Test me, Christiana said immediately. Test my parents. We'll donate whatever he needs. Dr. Song's expression was gentle but final. We already ran your blood type when you came in with injuries on Sunday. You're O positive. Your son inherited his rare phenotype from his father's side. Unless the father is available for testing, we're dependent on finding a match through the registry. The father. Christiana stood in that hospital hallway with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and the antiseptic smell of fear in her nostrils, and understood with sickening clarity that the man she'd spent 7 years trying to erase from their lives might be the only thing that could save Michael now. Genetics didn't lie. Blood called to blood. And if Michael had inherited Jiwoo's face and his eyes and his unnaturally sharp mind, then maybe, probably, he'd inherited his father's rare blood type too. She made it to the bathroom before she started shaking, bracing her hands against the sink and staring at her reflection in the mirror. She looked like someone who hadn't slept in days, who was holding on to sanity by her fingernails, who was about to do something she'd sworn she'd never do. She pulled out her phone with trembling hands and unblocked Jiwoo's number for the second time in 3 days. He answered on the first ring. "Christiana." "Michael's in the hospital," she interrupted, her voice flat and distant, shock insulating her from the full emotional impact. "There's an infection. He needs a blood transfusion. They're telling me he has a rare blood type that I don't have, which means he got it from you. I need you to come to Seoul National University Hospital and get tested. Now." The silence on the other end lasted exactly 2 seconds. "I'm on my way." Jiwoo arrived 23 minutes later, which meant he'd broken every traffic law in Seoul and possibly endangered lives to get there. Christiana was sitting in Michael's room when she saw him through the window, moving down the corridor with his security team trailing behind, his face pale, and set in an expression of barely controlled terror. He stopped at the nurse's station, spoke briefly to Dr. Song, and then they were both disappearing into the lab for testing. Michael stirred in the hospital bed, his fever-bright eyes finding her face. "Mama, I don't feel good." "I know, baby," Christiana said, smoothing his damp hair back from his forehead. "The doctors are taking care of you. You're going to be fine." "Promise?" She couldn't promise, but she nodded anyway because what else could she do? Promise. 20 minutes later, Dr. Song returned with results that confirmed what genetics had already written in Michael's DNA. Jiwoo's blood type was a perfect match, Bombay phenotype, rare enough to be remarkable, identical enough to save his son's life. "We can begin the transfusion immediately," Dr. Song said. "Mr. Seo, if you'll come with me to the donation suite." "Wait." Jiwoo was staring at Michael through the observation window, his expression stripped of every defense. "Can I see him first? Just for a moment." Christiana wanted to say no, wanted to keep this final boundary intact, but Dr. Song was already nodding and explaining that brief visits were acceptable before the procedure. So she stood aside and watched Seo Jiwoo meet his son for the first time, not in a parking lot full of strangers, not through surveillance photos, but here in this hospital room where Michael lay small and vulnerable, and so clearly made from the same blueprint as his father. Jiwoo approached the bed slowly, as if Michael might break if handled wrong. He stood there looking down at the boy who had his face, and Christiana watched something crack in his expression, something fundamental that he'd been holding together through sheer willpower. "Hi," Jiwoo said quietly. "I'm a friend of your mom's. I'm going to help make you better." Michael studied him with fever-dulled eyes that still held that distinctive analytical focus. "You're the man from the parking lot, the one who made Mama upset." "Yeah," Jiwoo admitted. "I did make her upset. I made a lot of mistakes. But right now, I'm going to do something right. You're going to get some of my blood, and it's going to help you fight the infection." "Will it hurt?" Michael asked with the blunt honesty of a 7-year-old who'd been hurt enough to know that adults sometimes lied about pain. "Not for you," Jiwoo said. "For me, maybe a little, but I don't mind. He stopped, looked at Christiana for permission she didn't give, then finished carefully. "You're important, and I want you to get better." Michael nodded, accepting this explanation the way he accepted most things, with thoughtful consideration and minimal fuss. "Thank you for helping." "You're welcome," Jiwoo said, and had to turn away before his composure shattered completely. The transfusion prep took another 30 minutes, time that Jiwoo spent in the donation suite having his blood drawn and processed, while Christiana sat with Michael, who drifted back into feverish sleep. She was scrolling through her phone, looking at flight confirmations for Thursday that she didn't know if she'd be able to use, when Jiwoo's head of security appeared in the doorway. "Dr. Vale, I apologize for the interruption, but I need to speak with you about Mr. Seo's schedule." Christiana stepped into the hallway, confused. "I don't understand. His schedule." The man looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight in a way that suggested he was delivering information he didn't want to share. "There's a syndicate meeting tonight. A treaty signing with representatives from 3 rival organizations. Mr. Seo's presence isn't optional. If he doesn't attend, the treaty fails, and we're looking at open war across multiple territories. The elders have made it clear that his absence will be interpreted as resignation from his position as Dragon Head. So, Christiana said, not understanding why this was her problem. So the meeting started 20 minutes ago, and he's here instead. He was supposed to be in the room when they opened negotiations. His absence has already caused significant tension. If he doesn't arrive in the next 30 minutes, everything falls apart. Christiana stared at the man, processing what he was really saying. Jiwoo was here, giving blood, missing the most important meeting of his criminal career, choosing Michael over the empire that had defined his entire life. "Did you tell him about the meeting?" she asked. "I called him the moment Michael was admitted. He said, and I quote, 'I don't give a fuck about the treaty. My son needs me.' Then he hung up and drove here." The words hit Christiana like a physical blow. Her son. Jiwoo had called Michael his son, had chosen him over power, had walked away from everything he'd spent 32 years building because a 7-year-old boy was sick. She thought about that night 7 years ago when he'd threatened to burn her family, when he'd chosen the syndicate over their unborn child, when he'd proven that power mattered more than love. And now, finally, when the choice came again in a different form, he'd made a different decision. "What happens to him if the treaty fails?" Christiana asked, though part of her didn't want to know. The security chief's expression was grim. Best case scenario, he loses his territory and position. Worst case, civil war starts and the elders decide he's more useful dead than disgraced. This isn't just about power, Dr. Vale. This is about survival, and he's here instead of there. Christiana walked back into Michael's room, where Dr. Song was setting up the transfusion equipment, where Jiwoo sat in a chair with tubes running from his arm to bags that would carry his blood to his son. He looked up when she entered, and she saw exhaustion and determination in equal measure. "There's a meeting," she said. "Your people told me if you leave now." "I'm not leaving," Jiwoo interrupted. "Not until I know he's okay, not for anything. This is your empire, everything you've built. You'll lose it all." Jiwoo looked at Michael sleeping in the hospital bed, his small chest rising and falling too fast, his face flushed with fever, and smiled with something that looked like peace. "I already lost everything that mattered. 7 years ago when I let you walk away. This," he gestured at the hospital room, the transfusion setup, the choice he'd made, "this is me finding it again. Even if it's too late, even if he never knows me. At least this one time I did the right thing." Christiana felt tears burning behind her eyes and refused to let them fall. "The right thing might get you killed." "Then I die knowing I saved my son," Jiwoo said simply. "That's better than living knowing I chose power over him again. I can't undo the past, Christiana, but I can make sure that today, right now, when Michael needed his father, I was here, even if he doesn't understand what that means." The transfusion began at 3:47 p.m., Jiwoo's rare blood flowing through tubes and into Michael's small body, carrying antibodies and healthy cells that would help fight the infection that modern medicine couldn't touch alone. Christiana watched the bags slowly empty, watched color start to return to Michael's face, watched his fever begin its gradual descent back toward normal ranges. By 4:30 p.m., Michael's vital signs had stabilized enough that Dr. Song allowed herself a cautious smile. By 5:00 p.m., news reached them that the syndicate treaty had collapsed, that 3 different organizations were mobilizing for conflict, that the elders had declared Jiwoo's position forfeit and issued orders to bring him in for formal censure. By 6:00 p.m., Michael woke up clear-eyed and asking for water, and Jiwoo sat in that hospital room watching his son recover and didn't seem to care that his empire was burning to ash somewhere across the city. He'd made his choice, had finally, impossibly, chosen love over power. And for the first time in 7 years, Christiana looked at Seo Jiwoo and saw not the monster who destroyed her, but the man he might have been all along if fear and duty hadn't corrupted everything good inside him. The hospital room settled into an uneasy quiet after Michael fell back asleep, his small chest rising and falling with a steadiness that hadn't existed an hour ago. The transfusion bag hung half-empty, Jiwoo's blood flowing through clear tubes into his son's arm, a visible connection between father and child that had never existed before. Christiana sat in the chair closest to Michael's bed, her hand resting protectively on his uninjured arm, while Jiwoo remained in the donation chair on the other side of the room, trapped by medical equipment, and the weight of 7 years' worth of consequences. Dr. Song had insisted he stay seated for at least 30 minutes after the donation, monitoring his vitals while his body adjusted to the blood loss. A nurse checked his blood pressure every 10 minutes, offered juice and crackers he didn't touch, and maintained professional distance from whatever complicated dynamic was playing out between the child's parents. The security team had been banished to the hallway after Jiwoo's head of security made one too many attempts to update him on the deteriorating situation across the city. Christiana watched Jiwoo through the uncomfortable silence, noting details she'd tried to forget, the way he held tension in his shoulders, the unconscious habit of rubbing his thumb against his index finger when stressed, the shadows under his eyes that spoke of months or years of poor sleep. He looked older than 32, looked like someone who'd been carrying impossible weight for too long. And despite everything he'd done, despite the threats and the cruelty and the 7 years of absence, she felt something dangerously close to sympathy trying to crack through her armor. "You didn't have to do this," she said finally, her voice quiet enough not to wake Michael. "Come here, miss your meeting, destroy everything you've built. You could have sent the blood through a courier, maintained distance, kept your empire intact." Jiwoo looked at her for a long moment, his expression stripped of the cold authority she remembered. "No, I couldn't. The moment you called and said he needed me, nothing else mattered. Not the syndicate, not the treaty, not the empire, just him. 7 years ago, everything else mattered more." "I know." Jiwoo's voice was rough with something that might have been regret. "I'm not going to defend what I did or who I was. I can't undo threatening you, forcing your hand, choosing power over." He stopped, his jaw clenching. "I made a choice that destroyed both of us. I've spent 7 years living with that decision, and every single day I understood a little more clearly that I traded everything real for something hollow." Christiana felt anger stirring beneath her exhaustion. "You don't get to do this. Show up now and claim you've changed, that you understand what you lost. You made your choice with full knowledge of what you were doing. You knew I was pregnant and you told me to eliminate the problem or watch my family burn. That wasn't ignorance or fear. That was cruelty with full intent." "You're right," Jiwoo said, and the admission seemed to cost him something. "I was cruel. I was calculating. I weighed your life and our child's life against the syndicate's stability, and I chose power. I told myself I was protecting you by forcing you away, but the truth is I was protecting myself, protecting my position, making sure nothing interfered with the empire I'd spent my entire life building." He paused, his eyes finding Michael's sleeping face. "I didn't know it was possible to regret something so completely that it becomes who you are. But that's what the past 7 years have been, living inside the consequences of the worst decision I ever made." "Regret doesn't fix what you broke," Christiana said, though her voice had lost some of its edge. "It doesn't erase the nights I spent terrified you'd find us. Doesn't undo the fact that Michael grew up without a father because his father chose violence over love." "I know that too." Jiwoo shifted in the chair, careful not to disturb the needle in his arm. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, Christiana. I don't deserve it and I'll never deserve it. I'm not asking for a relationship with Michael or for you to trust me or for any kind of redemption. He stopped, struggling with words that clearly didn't come easily. "I needed you to know that I would have made a different choice if I'd been stronger. If I'd had the courage to walk away from the syndicate 7 years ago, to choose you and our child over duty and fear, I should have been strong enough. I wasn't. And I'm sorry, not for the past, because sorry doesn't come close to covering what I did, but for not being strong enough to leave the life sooner. For letting power matter more than the only real thing I ever had." The words hung in the antiseptic air between them, and Christiana felt something shift in her chest. Not forgiveness, exactly, but maybe the beginning of understanding. She'd spent 7 years hatting Jiwoo with the purity of someone who'd been fundamentally betrayed, and hatred was easier than acknowledging the complexity of what he'd been facing. The syndicate didn't let people walk away. Defiance meant death, meant retaliation against family, meant exactly the kind of violence he'd threatened against her parents. He'd been trapped in a system that rewarded cruelty and punished sentiment, and he'd chosen survival over love because survival was all he'd ever been taught to value. It didn't excuse what he'd done, but it explained it in ways she'd refused to consider before. "What happens now?" she asked, nodding toward the door where his security team waited with increasingly urgent updates. "To you, when the syndicate realizes you chose us over them." Jiwoo smiled, and it was a strange expression, part resignation, part relief, like someone who'd finally stopped running from inevitable consequences. "Nothing good. The elders will consider this abandonment of duty. Daniel probably already has allies positioned to take over my territory. My assets will be frozen or seized, my legitimate businesses burned, my protection eliminated. Best case scenario, they let me walk away alive if I surrender everything quietly. Worst case, they make an example out of me to remind everyone what happens when you prioritize personal feelings over organizational loyalty." "And you're okay with that?" Christiana heard the disbelief in her own voice. "You're sitting here smiling while everything you've built falls apart." "I'm sitting here watching my son breathe easier because of my blood in his veins," Jiwoo corrected. "The empire was always going to fall apart eventually. That's what empires do. They consume everything until there's nothing left except power for power's sake. I just didn't understand that until I saw Michael standing outside that school and realized I'd traded a family for an empty throne." His phone had been buzzing continuously for the past 20 minutes, the screen lighting up with notifications he ignored. Finally, his head of security knocked on the door and entered without waiting for permission, his expression grim enough to communicate disaster. "Sir, I'm sorry, but you need to know. They've started moving against your assets. The real estate holdings in Gangnam are being seized. The shipping company's accounts have been frozen. Someone, probably Daniel, is systematically dismantling everything you own. By morning, you'll have nothing except what's in your personal accounts, and those will probably be next." Jiwoo nodded slowly, processing the information with the calm of someone who'd expected exactly this outcome. "Let them have it, all of it. I'm not fighting for territory anymore." The security chief looked like he wanted to argue, wanted to mobilize some kind of defense, but years of working for Jiwoo had taught him when orders were final. What about personal security? If they're moving this aggressively, assassination isn't off the table. "Then I die," Jiwoo said simply, "but not before I know Michael's okay. After that, whatever happens, happens." The man left, shaking his head, and Christiana found herself staring at Jiwoo with a mixture of disbelief and something dangerously close to respect. He was watching his empire burn in real time and showing no emotion except mild interest, as if billions of dollars and decades of power accumulation meant nothing compared to sitting in this hospital room with a son who didn't know him. Dr. Song returned at 7:15 p.m. with test results that made her smile broadly for the first time since Michael's admission. The infection markers are dropping significantly. His fever's down to 100.2 and still falling. The transfusion is working exactly as we hoped. He's going to be fine. The words hit the room like a physical presence, changing the atmosphere from tense waiting to breathless relief. Christiana felt tears she'd been holding back for hours finally spill over, her hand tightening on Michael's arm. Her son was going to be okay. Her brilliant, brave boy was going to survive because his father, the man who'd once told her to abort him, had given up everything to save his life. She looked at Jiwoo and saw him smiling, really smiling, with an expression of pure joy that transformed his face into something she barely recognized. He was crying too, tears streaming down his face while he laughed quietly, relief and happiness mixing into something that looked like freedom. "He's okay," Jiwoo said, speaking to himself more than anyone else. "He's going to be okay." "Thanks to you," Dr. Song said warmly. "That transfusion made all the difference. You saved your son's life." The words settled over Jiwoo like a benediction, like absolution for 7 years of mistakes. He'd saved his son, had chosen Michael over power, had sacrificed everything he'd spent his life building, had proven that when the choice came again in a different form, he could make a different decision. He finally chose his son over his ego and his money. It took him 7 years, but he did the right thing. If you would sacrifice everything for your child, subscribe to the channel. Join our family of protectors. The nurse disconnected Jiwoo from the donation equipment, checked his vitals one final time, and cleared him to leave. He stood slowly, steadying himself against the chair, his body adjusting to the blood loss. He looked at Michael sleeping peacefully, color returning to his face, breathing steady and strong. Then he looked at Christiana, and she saw a question in his eyes he didn't voice. Permission to stay, to be present, to exist in his son's life in whatever capacity she'd allow. "You should go," Christiana said, though the words came out gentler than she intended. He's stable now. He doesn't need... She stopped, unable to finish the sentence because it wasn't true anymore. Michael had needed his father, and his father had come, had given blood and sacrifice and everything that mattered. I know, Jiwoo said quietly. I just wanted to see him wake up, just once. But if you need me to leave, I will. Christiana thought about all the reasons she should send him away, should maintain the boundaries that had kept them safe for 7 years. But watching Jiwoo stand there with his empire burning, and his fortune disappearing and his life potentially ending, choosing to stay in this hospital room rather than fighting to save himself, she felt something crack in her carefully constructed hatred. You can stay, she heard herself say, until he wakes up, then we'll figure out what comes next. Jiwoo sat back down in the visitor's chair, his eyes never leaving Michael's face, and smiled like she'd just given him something infinitely more valuable than the billions he'd lost. Outside, Seoul burned with the beginning of a gang war that would reshape the city's criminal landscape. Assets changed hands, territories were seized, violence erupted in the power vacuum left by the dragon's abdication. But inside room 847 at Seoul National University Hospital, none of that mattered. A father watched his son breathe. A mother allowed herself to hope that people could change. And a 7-year-old boy slept peacefully, unaware that his blood now carried proof that love could triumph over power, even if it took 7 years and everything a man owned to prove it. Spring came to Seoul with cherry blossoms and cautious hope. The kind of weather that made people forget that winter had ever existed. 4 months had passed since the hospital, 4 months of Michael's complete recovery and Jiwoo's complete transformation, 4 months of Christiana learning that the monster she'd fled from had been replaced by something else entirely. Something quieter, humbler, maybe even human. Jiwoo lived in a modest 2-bedroom apartment in Mapogunao, the kind of neighborhood where nobody knew his name or cared about his past. The penthouse was gone, seized by the syndicate along with everything else he'd owned. The luxury cars, the real estate portfolio, the offshore accounts, all of it had been systematically stripped away by the elders who decided that public humiliation was more valuable than assassination. They'd let him live specifically so he could serve as a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happened when sentiment corrupted duty. Former dragonhead reduced to ordinary citizen, power transformed into powerlessness, empire collapsed into obscurity. He'd taken the fall without resistance, had signed away his assets and territory with the same calm detachment he'd shown in the hospital. The only thing he'd fought to keep was his life, and even that had been negotiated through intermediaries who made it clear that his survival was a gift he didn't deserve. The price was complete separation from the syndicate, total abandonment of the criminal world, and absolute silence about everything he knew. Jiwoo had accepted those terms and walked away from 32 years of legacy without looking back. He'd started the security consultancy 3 months ago, operating out of a small office above a convenience store. Legitimate work helping small businesses with risk assessment, corporate clients with executive protection planning, nothing that required violence or moral compromise. The money was modest but honest, enough to pay rent and buy groceries and save a little for the future. His former associates would have laughed at how far he'd fallen, the dragonhead reduced to filing insurance paperwork and conducting background checks. But Jiwoo felt lighter than he had in years, unburdened by the constant calculation of power dynamics and survival strategies. He slept through the night now, woke up without checking over his shoulder, lived without the paranoia that had defined his existence since childhood. It was boring and quiet and occasionally lonely, and he wouldn't have traded it for anything. Christiana had stayed in Seoul, though she'd kept her London townhouse as insurance against needing to flee again. The museum investigation had concluded with 17 artifacts being repatriated and 3 syndicate shell companies being shut down. Professional victory that satisfied her sense of justice, even as it complicated her personal life. She'd accepted a permanent consulting position that allowed her to work remotely, splitting time between recovering stolen heritage and raising her son in a city that felt less dangerous now that Jiwoo had removed himself from the equation. They developed an uneasy communication over the past 4 months, brief text messages about Michael's health that gradually expanded to include updates about his school achievements and small milestones. Jiwoo never asked for more than she offered, never pushed boundaries, never suggested that his sacrifice entitled him to anything except the privilege of knowing his son was thriving. But Christiana watched the progression of their texts, from cold medical updates to warmer mentions of Michael's science fair project and his new obsession with astronomy, and recognized it for what it was: the slow, painful process of rebuilding trust from absolute zero. Michael knew now, not everything, but enough. She'd sat him down 6 weeks after the hospital and explained in age-appropriate terms that the man who donated blood was his biological father, that he'd made mistakes before Michael was born, that he'd hurt people and done things that forced them to leave Korea. Michael had listened with the serious focus he brought to complex problems, had asked careful questions about why his father hadn't been part of his life, and had finally announced that he'd like to meet him again properly when Mama thought it was safe. The meeting had been arranged for today, neutral territory at a park near the river where children played soccer and families had picnics, and nothing terrible could happen in broad daylight. Christiana walked there with Michael, who'd insisted on wearing his favorite blue hoodie and bringing a soccer ball he'd gotten for his 8th birthday 2 weeks ago. He wasn't nervous exactly, but she could see the focus in his expression, the way he was processing through scenarios and preparing himself for complicated emotions. "What if he doesn't like me?" Michael asked as they approached the park entrance, his hand tight in hers. "He's going to love you," Christiana said with certainty, because whatever else Jiwoo had done wrong, his devotion to their son was absolute. "You're his child, Michael. That means something to him. Even though he didn't know me before. Especially because he didn't know you before. He missed 7 years. He's not going to waste any more time." They found Jiwoo waiting near the soccer fields, standing awkwardly with his hands in the pockets of jeans that looked new and slightly uncomfortable, like someone still adjusting to casual clothing after years of tailored suits. He'd changed in 4 months, looked healthier somehow, less hollow, like regular sleep and honest work had filled in spaces that power had carved out. When he saw them approaching, his entire face transformed with an expression of nervous hope that made Christiana's chest ache with complicated feelings she wasn't ready to examine. "Hi," Jiwoo said, directing the greeting at Michael with careful respect. "It's good to see you again. You look really healthy." Michael studied him with the analytical focus that was pure genetics, taking in details and cataloging similarities. "You look different than at the hospital, less scary." Jiwoo laughed, the sound surprised and genuine. "I probably was pretty scary that day. I was worried about you. Mama said you gave me blood, that you have a rare type that I have too." "That's right, Bombay phenotype. We're part of a very exclusive club, less than 1 in 250,000 people have it." Michael's eyes lit up with the fascination he brought to unusual statistics. "Really? That's so cool. What else is special about it?" They fell into conversation about blood types and genetics with an ease that surprised Christiana, Michael's endless curiosity meeting Jiwoo's patient explanations, the connection forming through shared biology and intellectual compatibility. She stood back slightly, watching father and son discover each other through science and statistics, and felt something loosen in her chest. Permission, maybe, to believe that this could work in whatever limited form they built it into. "I brought a soccer ball," Michael said, after they'd exhausted the fascinating topic of rare blood phenotypes. "Do you want to play?" Jiwoo looked at the ball, then at Christiana for permission she gave with a small nod. "I'd love to, though I should warn you, I'm pretty bad at soccer. I never really had time to practice when I was growing up." "That's okay," Michael said generously. "I can teach you, I'm really good." They moved to an empty patch of grass, and Christiana watched Jiwoo attempt to kick a soccer ball with a 7-year-old who patiently corrected his form and demonstrated proper technique with the authority of a child who'd spent years in London youth leagues. Jiwoo was terrible, uncoordinated and awkward, clearly more familiar with violence than sports, but he tried with the determination of someone who understood this was the most important game he'd ever play. Michael scored on him repeatedly, celebrating each goal with uninhibited joy, and Jiwoo laughed every time, genuine and free, like he'd forgotten what happiness felt like until his son showed him. They played for 20 minutes, both of them breathless and grinning, and Christiana found herself smiling too, watching this impossible scene that shouldn't exist, The former crime lord and the boy he'd almost never known, connected by blood and second chances and the grace of survival. Finally, Michael collapsed on the grass, breathing hard, and Jiwoo sat beside him at a respectful distance, not quite touching but close enough to matter. They looked so similar in that moment. The same profile, the same way of tilting their heads, the same hands, that Christiana's throat tightened with emotions too complicated to name. "Are you the one who helped the doctors fix me?" Michael asked suddenly, his voice serious despite his flushed, happy face. "When I was sick, Mama said someone gave me blood. But she didn't say it was you." Jiwoo looked at Christiana, who nodded permission to answer honestly. He turned back to Michael, and she saw tears gathering in his eyes even as he smiled. "Yeah, that was me. You needed blood, and I happened to have the right type, so I gave you some of mine." "Did it hurt?" "A little," Jiwoo admitted, "but not as much as thinking something bad might happen to you. That hurt worse than anything." Michael processed this with characteristic thoughtfulness, his young mind working through complex emotional mathematics. "Mama said you made mistakes before I was born, bad mistakes that hurt people." "I did," Jiwoo said, not looking away, giving Michael the respect of absolute honesty. "I hurt your mother very badly. I made choices that caused a lot of pain. I'm not proud of who I was." "But you're different now." "I'm trying to be. I can't undo what I did, but I can make sure I don't do those things anymore. I can try to be someone better, someone worthy of—" His voice broke slightly. "Someone worthy of knowing you." Michael was quiet for a long moment, then reached out and touched Jiwoo's hand with the casual trust of childhood. "I'm glad you helped fix me, and I'm glad you're trying to be better. Mama says people can change if they want it badly enough." Jiwoo's tears spilled over then, streaming down his face while he nodded and held his son's small hand like it was the most precious thing in the world. "Your mama's right, and I want to, more than anything." Christiana watched them sit together in the spring sunshine, connected by genetics and grace, and the long, difficult road of redemption that had no guarantee of destination. She didn't know what would happen next, if Jiwoo would remain a peripheral figure in Michael's life, or if trust could be rebuilt enough for something more substantial. She didn't know if she could ever forgive him completely, if the wound he'd carved 7 years ago would ever fully heal. But watching him cry while holding their son's hand, watching Michael choose compassion over resentment, she thought maybe forgiveness wasn't the point. Maybe the point was that people could change. That love could triumph over power if someone was brave enough to sacrifice everything for it. That a boy could carry his father's blood and his mother's strength and grow into something better than either of them had been separately. The dragon had fallen. The phoenix had risen. And from the ashes of their destruction, a little king was learning what it meant to be merciful, to be strong, to choose love even when it would be easier to choose hate. Michael pulled his hand away and stood up, brushing grass from his jeans. "Can we play again next week? And maybe you can practice before then so you're not so bad." Jiwoo laughed through his tears, wiping his face with the back of his hand. "I'll practice every day, I promise." "Okay, it's a deal." Michael looked at his mother, his expression content and uncomplicated. "Can we get ice cream now? I'm hungry." Christiana nodded, and they started walking toward the park entrance, Michael running ahead to examine something interesting he'd spotted on the path. Jiwoo fell into step beside her, maintaining careful distance, respecting every boundary while hopping for permission to exist in their orbit. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For this, for letting me know him. I know I don't deserve it." "You don't," Christiana agreed, but her voice was gentle rather than cruel. "But Michael deserves to know his father if his father can be someone worth knowing. Can you be that person?" "I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying," Jiwoo said, and the promise carried the weight of someone who'd lost everything and found the only thing that mattered. They walked in silence for a moment, watching Michael chase after a butterfly with the unself-conscious joy of childhood, and Christiana felt the last pieces of her armor start to crack. Not forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever, but something softer. Acceptance, perhaps. Acknowledgement that the man who'd threatened her 7 years ago had burned himself down and rebuilt something different from the ashes. "Next Saturday," she said. "Same time, same park, but you have to bring your own soccer ball and actually practice." Jiwoo smiled, the expression transforming his face into something young and hopeful and finally, impossibly free. I'll be here, every Saturday, for as long as you'll let me. And walking away from that park with ice cream sticky fingers and her son's laughter echoing through spring air, Christiana thought maybe that was enough. Maybe second chances didn't require romance or complete forgiveness or a return to what had been broken. Maybe they just required showing up, doing better, choosing love over power every single day until the choice became natural instead of sacrifice. The dragon had learned to be human. The phoenix had learned to trust again. And the little king was teaching them both that mercy was stronger than vengeance, that family was built through presence rather than biology, that love, real, honest, hard-won love, was worth every empire that ever fell.